Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Isabelle Ramdoo, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals and Metals for Sustainable Development, a global platform comprising of 79 mineral-rich countries. A very warm welcome to this webinar this afternoon, which is co-organized by the Africa Policy Research Institute, APRI, and the Office of Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana, member of the European Parliament from Germany, in the run-up to the 6th African European Union Summit that will take place tomorrow, 17th February, and Friday, 18th February in Brussels. Let me make a few logistical announcements before introducing the theme of the webinar, the program, and our speakers. The webinar has interpretation in 3 languages, English, French, and German. And by now, I think most of you are familiar with Zoom functions. But if you look at the bottom right of your screen, you will see a little globe icon. Just click on this to choose your preferred language. Choose English, keep it on the flow language if you want, if you understand the 3 languages, but you can also choose your preferred language, English, French, and German. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on APRI website within a few days after the event. And we will have a panel discussion and we will have Q&A sessions. Prepare your questions while our experts are discussing. You can post your questions in the Q&A box. This is an interactive box, which means that you can comment or like what other participants put in the function, and whatever you like will go up as a priority. And if you have technical issues, use the chat function for that, and then the moderators will address the issue. But if you want to have questions, please use Q&A chat, and if you're speaking German, it's FNA. And please indicate also when you pose your questions to whom the question is addressed, and I will do my best to get them to our panelists during the Q&A session. We are here today to have a frank and open conversation with thought leaders from Africa around some of the issues that will be on the menu of the upcoming AU-EU Summit of Heads of States, which is the highest political forum for the partnership between the African continent and the European Union. The summit usually takes place every 3 years, but this time around, the COVID pandemic led to the postponement of the event, which was scheduled to take place in November 2020. 4 years and a pandemic after the last summit, which took place in November 2017 in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, leaders from both sides of the continent are finally meeting for the next 2 days, but in starkly different context. The global health crisis has been and is still challenging for countries of both continents. Vaccination policies and border closures have put to test the loudly celebrated solidarity across the 2 continents. The socio-economic impacts of the pandemic have thrown many people into vulnerable situations on both continents. In Africa, some countries have even lost decades of development efforts. Climate emergencies have repeatedly impacted both sides of the Mediterranean and have shown how unprepared and helpless countries on both continents can be in responding to emergencies, calling into question the artificial division of responsibilities between the global North and the global South. Geopolitical tensions, once mostly thought to be a regular feature of African politics, is now at the door of Europe. And while the partnership was dormant for 4 years, in the meantime, both Africa and Europe have been very active with their other global partners. So what shall we expect for tomorrow and Friday? There is no doubt that the partnership between Europe and Africa is important and relevant, not just because of our historical ties and geographical proximity. The 2 continents are deeply interdependent, and the current tense geopolitical context, strategic partnerships are central for the balance of power. And precisely for these reasons, the success of the summit will definitely call for a different type of dialogue with clear and concrete actions. And if leaders of both continents want to have a renewed partnership that is fit for purpose for the future, the dialogue needs to embrace a different paradigm, much and must be inclusive and reflective of interest, realities, concerns, and differences from both sides of the Mediterranean. The objective of our conversation today is to stimulate a reflection and hear from African thought leaders and experts on how they view different aspects of the partnership between Europe and Africa. We hope that the discussion will find an echo in the policy circles tomorrow and beyond. But before we dive into the core of our discussion, let me briefly take you through the program of the next few minutes. We have 90 minutes, and then introduce our first two speakers. In a few moments, we will have some welcoming words from our co-host, Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana. Dr. Pierrette Herzberger-Fofana was elected to the European Parliament on 26 May 2019 as a candidate of the Group of Greens, European Free Alliance, and has still been campaigning for a democratic and humane Europe as an MEP. She is first vice chair of the Committee on Development and of the Delegation for Relations with the Pan-African Parliament. She is also the co-president of the Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup of the European Parliament and is a member of the delegation of the CARIFORUM EU Parliamentarian Committee, where CARIFORUM stands for countries of the Caribbean region. She is also a substitute on the Committee of Foreign Affairs and the Committee of Women's Rights and Gender Equality, and a delegation of the ACP EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly, where ACP stands for African, Caribbean, and Pacific. After her welcoming remarks, Mr. Joseph Owonakono will make a keynote address. Mr. Owonakono is the president of AfriUbana, a Pan-African association of fruit producers and exporters. Prior to this, Mr. Owonakono was a member of parliament in Cameroon. He is the former ACP co-president of the ACP EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly. After the keynote, we will have a panel discussion with 3 panelists that I will introduce during the panel discussion, and then we will open the floor for Q&A before wrapping up with some concrete key takeaways. So let me pass on the floor to Dr. Herzberger-Fofana for her welcoming remarks. Dr. Herzberger-Fofana, the floor is yours.
Voilà. Merci bien, Madame Isabelle Ramdoo. Vous m'entendez? Oui, merci bien. Mesdames, Messieurs, tout d'abord, je vous remercie tous de vous joindre à nous cet après-midi, où que vous soyez, puisque nous sommes virtuellement. C'est donc un plaisir pour moi d'accueillir à cet événement en marge du 6e sommet de l'Union européenne et de l'Union africaine, qui, après avoir été reporté à 2 reprises, s'ouvrira donc demain, le 17 février, et vendredi 18 février à Bruxelles, sur un fond de crise sanitaire et aussi de remous politiques qui secouent notre planète. Le sommet entre l'Union européenne et l'Union africaine devrait être l'occasion de poser les jalons d'un partenariat renouvelé, d'égal à égal, et non plus une relation professeur-élève, mais une relation fondée sur la confiance et une compréhension mutuelle des défis que connaissent les 2 continents afin de définir une vision commune tournée vers un avenir prometteur et bâtir un espace de solidarité, de sécurité et renforcer le développement durable, voire la prospérité pour tous. Les relations entre l'Afrique et l'Europe ne doivent pas seulement être discutées entre chefs d'État et de gouvernement. Ce sommet a besoin d'entendre aussi une diversité de voix, tant africaines qu'européennes, pour enrichir les débats sur la manière dont ces 2 continents, liés par la géographie et l'histoire, organisent leurs relations. Je me réjouis donc que cet événement réunisse des experts, aussi bien des universitaires africains, des politiciens comme mon collègue, M. Owona, du continent et aussi de la diaspora. Ils apporteront donc un regard critique sur la relation entre les 2 continents. J'espère également qu'ils vont partager avec nous leurs idées et aussi la manière de forger une meilleure relation entre l'Europe et l'Afrique. En ce qui concerne notre événement, tout de suite, ce panel d'experts examinera donc les relations entre l'Afrique et l'Europe sur 3 thèmes principaux qui sont d'une importance cruciale en tenant compte donc des paramètres tels que les relations commerciales, l'immigration, le dérèglement climatique. Ils vont également discuter des outils et peut-être esquisser des solutions qui permettent de donner au partenariat renouvelé un nouvel élan et aussi une nouvelle forme de dialogue. Le commerce entre les 2 continents est très important. En tant que bloc, l'Europe est le premier partenaire commercial du continent africain, ce qui signifie que la relation commerciale entre ces 2 continents est un élément clé des moyens de subsistance, aussi bien pour l'Europe que pour l'Afrique. La migration, un sujet tant controversé, est trop souvent vu sous l'angle de la menace. C'est aussi donc un sujet important pour nous, surtout pour l'Europe aussi, oui, qui est un continent vieillissant et par rapport à l'Afrique, un continent composé d'une population jeune. Des voies légales de migration seraient pourtant préférables et limiteraient une migration illégale et le trafic humain avec son lot de misère en transformant l'Atlantique et la Méditerranée en un grand cimetière. Le changement climatique qui provoque des ravages dans différentes parties du monde, mais peut-être plus, dans les pays africains que dans tous les autres continents. L'Afrique est l'un des continents les plus vulnérables suite à ce dérèglement climatique dont il n'est pas lui-même producteur. La façon dont les 2 continents abordent ces 3 questions sera déterminante pour l'évolution de leurs relations dans un avenir proche. Certes, de nombreux autres thèmes vont être au menu du sommet Union européenne-Afrique. Personnellement, j'aurais souhaité que la question du devoir de mémoire soit évoquée. C'est d'ailleurs l'un de mes amendements dans notre résolution, et c'est une question sensible de notre histoire commune entre l'Europe et l'Afrique, telle que la restitution des biens et des œuvres, des biens culturels et des œuvres d'art, qui reposent donc dans les musées en Europe. Mais nous avons donc décidé de nous concentrer sur ces 3 thèmes-là que j'ai mentionnés, et c'est pourquoi je suis vraiment heureuse que ce groupe d'experts discute de ces questions, pas nécessairement pour les critiquer, mais pour réfléchir à la façon de faire pour en sorte que l'on puisse donner à notre relation Union européenne, Union africaine, un autre visage et que l'on aborde ces questions épineuses dans un esprit de collégialité et de solidarité. Donc, j'encourage tous ceux qui nous écoutent à dialoguer avec nos panélistes et à apporter également leur voix au débat. Je voudrais m'arrêter là-dessus, mais tout d'abord, je tiens tout particulièrement à remercier l'équipe de APRI, Africa Policy Research Institute, pour son travail visant à apporter une perspective critique de la diaspora africaine aux relations Union européenne-Afrique. Et je suis aussi très heureuse donc d'avoir eu la possibilité d'organiser cet événement avec eux. Et c'est pour cela que je vous encourage tous à vous intéresser donc à leur travail. En attendant, je vous souhaite donc de passer des instants agréables avec nos panélistes à qui je redonne la parole. Et tout d'abord, à notre modératrice, Madame Ramdoo. Merci à tous de votre aimable attention.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Herzberger-Fofana. Merci et je suis sûre que nos panélistes vont rebondir sur les points que vous avez soulevés. même si toutes les questions ne pourront pas être abordées aujourd'hui. Vous faisiez tout à l'heure allusion au travail formidable que fait APRI. Moi, je voulais les appeler pour les 3 prochaines années parce que nous sommes en train de discuter du cadre des 3 prochaines années de relations entre l'UE et l'Afrique. Et je suis sûre qu'on aura l'occasion au cours des 3 prochaines années d'en discuter, peut-être de parler de la question du devoir de mémoire, etc. Et je souhaite vraiment que ces questions soient abordées. Et comme vous dites, en 90 minutes, on ne peut pas tout dire. Et donc, j'espère que ces questions seront discutées plus tard. Merci beaucoup, je vous remercie. Maintenant, je voudrais donner la parole à Monsieur Joseph Owana-Kono pour son allocution. Monsieur Owana-Kono, vous avez la parole. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la modératrice. Je voudrais d'abord redire toute ma fierté pour le grand honneur qui nous est fait de participer à ce panel et puis dire merci à ma sœur, qui est ma collègue, mais c'est d'abord ma sœur, Dr Herzberger-Fofana, de nous avoir donné l'opportunité de participer à ce panel. Dire également toute notre disponibilité pour l'avenir, y compris pour les 3 ans, les 3 prochaines années dont vous parlez et pour les sujets qui seront abordés au cours de ces 3 prochaines années. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me switch to my keynote address. In his speech to the European Parliament on 19th January 2022, French President Emmanuel Macron declared that Europe has a duty to propose a new alliance to the African continent. The destinies of the 2 shores of the Mediterranean are linked, as he put it. At a time when the post-Cotonou Agreement opens a period of renewal of the intercontinental partnership, developing a modernized conception of the Afro-European alliance is essential. This inflection will serve the common to boost sustainable and shared prosperity. The European Union remains the main investor in Africa and its leading trading partner. Beyond this economic observation, our 2 continents are linked by their past, their great geographical proximity, their common values, and the close ties that unite them. At the last Africa-Europe Summit held in Abidjan in 2017, discussions paved way for a new Africa-Europe alliance, marking a strengthening of political interest in the Africa-Europe strategy. This new summit between the African Union and the European Union is an important milestone in the redefinition of our relationship and an opportunity to place agriculture at the center of the projects carried out by our governments. At a time when the European Union is resolutely committed to moving from a development aid approach to an investment approach of the African continent, it is time to measure the concrete applications of the construction of a partnership of equals between Africa and Europe. The economic and social asymmetries that characterize the 2 continents should not be forgotten. The latest demographic study published by the World Bank in 2020 reminds us that in sub-Saharan Africa, 58% of the population lives in rural areas, too often struggling with near endemic poverty. The ability of our leaders to develop an ambitious strategy for agricultural development will be key to eradicating hunger, with 82% of the continent's poor living in rural areas in 2019. In the face of these realities, the Africa-Europe partnership must give primacy to the consolidation of sustainable agricultural systems. Indeed, agriculture is a sector that links regions facing significant challenges. It is the primary source of income for rural areas in Africa, and agricultural enterprises play a vital role in retaining populations by providing local employment opportunities. Recent UN projections forecast a growth from 1 to 2.4 billion people by 2050, by which time half of the inhabitants will be under 25 years old. The ability of the African economy to absorb the millions of new entrants that will swell its labor market will depend largely on our ability to implement a genuine rural development plan now. I insist on the now. This is a fundamental prerequisite for achieving the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, including the promotion of full and productive employment and decent work for all. The benefits in terms of job creation, territorial balance, and food security justify massive investment in the agricultural sector in a context where the latest FAO estimations indicate that Africa contains 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. Moreover, one must not forget the impact of climate change on the continent. In the light of COP27, which will be held this year on the African continent in Cairo, it is essential to take action to protect cultivable lands and maintain biodiversity. To this end, European support to African farmers' transformation initiatives is essential to move towards sustainable agri-food systems. In 2018, the Africa Rural Task Force met to propose an Africa-Europe agenda for rural transformation. It resulted in a report that deserves to be upgraded as a basis for dialogue between African and European stakeholders. Among the recommendations put forward are the establishment of innovation clusters to support agri-entrepreneurs, the development of an Afro-European platform of young farmers, and the acceleration of funding for projects related to food and the fight against climate change. All these proposals should be followed up in depth in the context of the restructuring of the Africa-Europe partnership. The European Union is at a turning point for the future of its agri-food sector. With its farm-to-fork strategy, which is at the heart of the European Green Deal, the EU is promoting organic farming and raising its sustainability standards to an even higher level. Today, Europeans and Africans share this common aspiration for products coming from sustainable agriculture. This goal can only be achieved through a combined effort from producer to the retailer. Consequently, the entire value chain must play its part in creating shared responsibility. The Sustainable Cocoa Initiative, recently launched by several European countries and bringing together companies in the sector, trade unions, NGOs, and retailers, is a good example. Such projects involving all the stakeholders to work towards a fairer and more equitable trade would be well advised to multiply and to be implemented by sector in order to make concrete use of the Africa-Europe cooperation. To quote the conclusion of the report by the Association of Agriculteurs Français et Développement International, AFDI, on the subject of our continental relationship, the consolidation, quote, of the Europe-Africa partnership cannot be effective without genuine consideration of rural populations and common food issues. Now that this has been established, it is time to make strong commitments and take action together for sustainable agriculture as a common basis for prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your kind attention, and I wish you an interesting and committed panel discussion to reflect on the path towards a policy fit for purpose between Europe and Africa. Once again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Owonokono, for those remarks and for providing us some food for thought, le mot de dire, for the panel discussion. I'm sure our panelists will pick up some of the points that you raised during the discussion on, particularly on the forthcoming discussion now on climate diplomacy and then trade. I think, those resonate very well with what we're going to discuss now. Let me now turn to the panel for the conversation. As I mentioned earlier, and this is for all the participants listening to us, you're more than welcome to share your thoughts and comments and questions to our panelists. Feel free to start putting your reflections in the Q&A box, and I'll pick them up as we have the conversation with the panelists. I have the pleasure now of introducing three thought leaders from the African continent who each have played and continue to play an instrumental role in shaping policy debates and providing concrete pathways to our leaders in their respective field of expertise. As Dr. Herzberger-Fofana highlighted, this part of the conversation will focus on three issues. First, climate diplomacy and joint actions needed for a sustainable future between our two continents. Then the delicate and complex question of migration and mobility. And last but not least, trade relationships between Europe and Africa. To offer their thoughts and perspectives, we have among us this afternoon Saliem Fakir, who is the founder and executive director of the Africa Climate Foundation, the leading African think tank on climate-related questions based in South Africa. Prior to establishing the ACF, Saliem was the head of the Policy and Futures Unit of the World Wildlife Foundation in South Africa and was the director of the World Conservation Union, also in South Africa. He also had several academic positions as including as associate director for the Center for Renewable and Sustainable Energy at Stellenbosch University. And for those of you who read South African press, you know that Saliem is a very prolific writer in many different newspapers and journals. We also have the privilege of having Ottilia Anna Maunganitze from the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, which she joined in 2009. Ottilia is currently the head of special projects in the Office of the Executive Director. She explores new areas of work for the ISS and helps to inform institutional strategy. Ottilia also worked as a legal advisor and has wide experience in international criminal justice, international human rights law, and migration trends and policy, among others. And we are glad to welcome Dr. Cheikh Tidiane, the founder and executive director of the African Center for Trade, Integration and Development, CACID en français. Dr. Dieye is a member of the West African Economic Partnership Agreements, EPA, negotiating committee, and several other technical committees of the Economic Commission for Western African States, ECOWAS. He also holds academic positions in universities in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, and is a regular trainer at the Trade Capacity Building and Training Center in Tanzania, and is also course director at the UN Institute for Economic Development and Planning. Let me start perhaps with one of the most complex questions, both for the African continent members and for the partnership between the two continents, climate diplomacy. And Saliem, I'll turn to you first. While we all know that the African continent has historically and contemporarily contributed least to global carbon emission and hence to human-induced climate changes, yet African countries are in many ways already suffering from global warming's most devastating consequences. Effects are being felt through extreme weather conditions, disturbances on livelihoods and threats to food insecurity, irreversible impacts on land, water, etc. African countries cannot afford to delay action on climate change. just like we cannot afford to take the wrong actions collectively and with our partners. In that sense, one would expect climate diplomacy towards a prosperous and sustainable future to be high on the agenda of the summit tomorrow. And with sustainability comes greener and cleaner future, and in the short and medium term, and probably most pressingly, preparedness and adaptation for adaptation and mitigation. Yet, looking at the trends and proposals running up to the summit, it doesn't seem to fully reflect Africa's priorities and let alone realities and needs. The EU has a clear pathway for itself, the Green Deal. So my first question to you is, where are we on the African continent in terms of defining our own pathways and priorities?
Thank you, Isabelle. Special greetings to Honorable Member Fofana and Dr. Kono. And also, just to say, it's a pleasure to be here on the APRI forum. I just want to check if my internet is fine and you can hear me clearly. Thank you. I want to, obviously this is a very vast topic, and it's we can spend the entire day talking about it. I thought I want to contextualize this in terms of the Europe-Africa negotiations and the summit that will start tomorrow. Africa is not very far from Europe. It's 13, 15 kilometers. But we have a vast disjuncture at three levels. The first level is around the very concept of what Africa is and its people and their needs, which I think is fundamental for us to appreciate, because it's very important to understand that in the context of climate diplomacy. The second part is even though the summit will come up with a declaration, the mutual and common interests are not as firm as one would want to believe. And I think these are issues that we will continue to grapple with beyond the summit. And I think thirdly, the early versions of the declaration talked about an alliance, and I think that point of alliance is no longer on the table because the sense of belonging to a common world between the two continents is something that we are still struggling to find our feet on. And we have to understand that since the Africa-Europe summits started, I think going back to the first one in Egypt in the year 2000, the world has fundamentally shifted. The context for Europe and Africa has changed. In fact, Europe is in the throes of a potential break in 70 years of peace on the continent, which was the dividend that Europe benefited from, the peace and security following World War II. If there's a war tomorrow in the Ukraine, which we don't know how it's going to unfold and how it's going to reorder the balance of interests in Europe, and in particular Europe's dependence on gas, it will increasingly have to rely on gas from somewhere else, and that will certainly be from the continent. Yet in its climate diplomacy, it's talking about, in a contradictory way, talking about moving away from gas in Europe and telling Africans they should do so themselves. So this juncture is something that we have to watch for. The second part is that the lack of peace and security in Europe also will play itself out on the continent, because the contextualization of the climate debate revolves around intrinsic European fears, which are largely gravitating not around developmental needs between the two partners. A lot of it is around the protection of Europe from its own fears of the movement of people from Africa into Europe. It is put out in a particular paradigm. which is not a useful one, as Honorable Member Fofana has just noted, that we have to have a different rethink around migration and mobility. And the debate around climate and issues is also located in the debate around peace, security, and migration, because climate affects land use, it affects agriculture, weather tends to force people out of particular geographic locations, and they are forced to migrate. There's forced migration. But the issue of migration is really about the fundamental issue. None of these peace, security, nor protection against vulnerability of climate, against climate vulnerability, can be dealt with without the underlying issues on the continent that need to be addressed. And that is really fundamentally about the need for economic transformation. The third area, which I think is going to become a very crucial point in which Europe would be competing, and this is another issue that has emerged in the last decade. Europe's interest in Africa also revolves around the elephant in the room, which is around China's growing presence on the continent and China's investment increasingly in infrastructure, which Europe is lagging behind on. Most of the significant infrastructure investments in the last decade have actually come from China. And if you watched China's FOCAC meeting in October, there's actually a new paradigm around climate and development, actually, far more, in my view, responsive to the needs and alignment with Africa's interests than what you would find out of the summit tomorrow. And you can see where the disjunctions are beginning to emerge. The third area is around the fact that Africa is not anymore a superficial continent. It actually is, if you take a more integrated approach to Africa, if you look at its doubling of its population, if you look at its mineral endowment, its growing professionalization and education of its population, particularly young people, and if you consider the potential to have greater inter-regional trade because of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, it's an economy that's going to look like 3 to 7 trillion in the next 3 decades. That is not something that is small. That's a significant economic geography, and it's an important geography in which it requires Europe to take a far more enlightened view than it's currently doing in terms of not only dealing with trade, but also climate diplomacy. And the reason why I want to move on to the climate diplomacy part is that the paradigm of the existing European model of engagement around climate, and given the fears around migration, peace, security, and all those things that are more the primordial concerns of Europe and not really of growing importance to Africa, because ours is more developmental and around economic transformation, is that the approaches around climate diplomacy is more around an aid support model rather than investment support model. And this a shift has to happen fundamentally because I would say that in the next year you will see stronger changes in climate diplomacy on the continent, because there's a coherence starting to develop between the African group of negotiators. After the AU summit that was held 2 weeks ago, a new vision for climate resilience and development was released by the AU, and the CACID is going to play a bigger role, which is being chaired by Kenya. And you can see the elements of the climate development nexus issues are starting to take shape, and that there will have to be obviously more work being done on this. And I think we are going to move away from a aid support framework for climate towards more an investment model. And that is at the moment being led by South Africa through the Just Energy Transition Transaction. This was not something that came out of Europe. This was a thing that came out of the South African need for energy transition because of its coal dependency. And there's increasing interest from countries like Rwanda, Egypt, and other Morocco, and so on trying to design something like this. So this flip has happened, and what we find in the development framework of the EU, climate is treated as an issue around managing risk rather than about increasing investment flow on the continent that can actually lead to supporting Africa's economic transformation. And lastly, let me say that Europe's strategic competition will increase as it decarbonizes, and it will be a strategic competition with both markets seeking solutions, technology upsurge, but also blocking countries from entering European markets because of their carbon intensity of their goods and services. And that's certainly directed against China, the US, but there are special agreements happening with the US. And in this case, the European Green Deal, which will hardly get a mention in tomorrow's declaration, is potentially not a solution for Africa, but it could be also a barrier to our growth and development. So we have to think of the strategic competition as also increasing demand and supply for critical minerals that will be crucial for the sort of green revolution in Europe. And Africa is going to play a big role in that. At least 60% of the world's critical minerals are in Africa. And we as Africans will also have to define a much more strategic engagement, not a narrow one, that also increases, if I may use the word, as Europe has done, our own strategic autonomy, using climate diplomacy as a tool for development and economic transformation. So thank you very much. I know I've gone a little bit more than I should, but I apologize for that.
Thank you a lot, Saliem. No, you didn't go over time, and I think you really set the stage very well and covered, all the key aspects and the things that have changed, at least in the last 4 years on the African continent, when you think about the nexus between climate and development. Maybe just on a follow-up on that one, given this, climate development nexus you mentioned that is taking shape in light of the resilience document that came out, and also looking at the fundamental differences in approach that exist between Europe and Africa, what do you think this partnership or the summit, not the partnership in itself, but the summit starting tomorrow, should think of to make an effective change in climate diplomacy?
I think the summit is unlikely to deliver that, and the reason is that it's already set into a particular direction. But hopefully, post the summit, I think that institutions like APRI, certainly the ACF, and institutions like the Africa-Europe Foundation, with European think tanks, and also not just the European Union and the Commission, but also the capitals of European member states, we have to have an engagement around a different paradigm around climate diplomacy. And I would say that paradigm needs, if not a refresh, it requires a fundamental shift in order for this model of moving from aid support to investment support is materialized. And hopefully that will become the basis for the next Africa-Europe partnership. And I think China is already, in a strange way, it has been lagging behind on climate diplomacy. Having spoken to Chinese institutions myself, I can see that the new paradigm that they are busy taking on is far more aligned with Africa's climate development nexus approach, and will unfortunately leave Europe behind if it doesn't also shift the game. if you want. Thanks.
Thanks, Saliem. We'll come back during the discussion, I think, on that question, because I think there's a lot to say here. Maybe let me turn to Otilia on the question of migration and mobility, and then we'll have a round of Q&A later, and we'll continue the discussion. Otilia, the question of migration has perhaps become the most complex and politically sensitive issue between the two continents. It has many facets, and it is certainly seen from different perspectives, depending on where one sits. There is often a perception that Africa is a massive reservoir of migrants, and this is exacerbated by the rise of populist movements in Europe, which is creating lesser acceptance from many countries, including for regular migrants. Maybe first, can we set the record straight? What is the current situation in terms of flows, trends, and perhaps in terms of political positioning to address this issue?
Thank you very much, Isabelle, and thank you also to the co-panelists and the organizers for this session. Now, you've already helped me in many ways by framing the context, and a special thanks to Madame Herzberger-Fofana for already alluding to the complexity around the migration debate. So I say complexity around migration debate, not around migration, because really it's a discourse and a perception issue over the actual migration and mobility on the continent. I'm going to contain my initial response to no more than 4 minutes, so we can get into the conversation a little bit more. You spoke about misperception of Africa as a reservoir of migrants, and I want to correct that misperception. Africa is a continent on the move. Where the misperception lies is where Africans move to in their numbers. The reality is over 80% of movement is within the African continent. While there is movement out of the continent, it's not only towards Europe, it's also towards the Middle East, towards the Americas, and to further east into Asia as well. That doesn't change the reality that people are indeed moving towards Europe. It doesn't change that narratives that have found root in a number of European countries can weigh or have some credence in the fact that if you do see a migrant, you see a migrant. So often people who complain about the presence of migrants don't need to speak about 1 million or 2 million. They are referencing the one that is in their neighborhood. They are referencing the myths and perceptions around migrants taking jobs or economic opportunities, migrants as being the ones that are instrumental in crime in the community, over understanding what the real issues are. It's often easy to problematize people over looking at the challenges. I'm speaking to you from South Africa, where a lot of these debates also happen in South Africa around the role and the place of migrants within South African society. The debate is a bit different here on the southern tip of Africa because the question of jobs is interconnected with the question of limited economic opportunities and unemployment within the country itself. So while we can accept that the majority of movement is within the African continent, we also need to have an honest conversation around the way in which Africa engages with Europe on the question of migration. I'm careful in calling it the question of migration and not the problem of migration, because the one thing we all need to accept, quite frankly, is people are going to move. What we need to ensure is that that movement is not further criminalized, that we in fact create more criminals while still needing to address our issues. The final point of my response really relates to the distinction between the perceptions. In Africa, for the most part, because people will move if voluntarily in search of better economic opportunities, if forced because of conflict and other forms of instability, or Saliem, because of climate change that impacts their livelihoods. While in Europe, it's seen more as an inflow of people from outside the continent. if, and maybe we'll touch on this in the next part of the conversation, if there isn't a matching of the demographic issues on the African continent with the skills, labor, developmental imperative, not only for Africa, because often when we speak about development, we say Africa needs to develop because the presumption is that Europe is as developed as it will ever be. The reality is both continents are developing in different ways. Perhaps, of course, Europe being further ahead on certain elements. So the perception that has resulted in a securitized migration policy externalized from Europe onto the African continent ultimately does what it shouldn't do. It doesn't make Africa safer. It doesn't limit the number of people who wish to move. It simply enhances the risks that people are willing to take to make those journeys. So we need to rethink security as the thing that informs how we respond to questions of migration. And how can we do that? And I'll end with that. We need to be looking at the developmental potential. We need to be interrogating what Mr. Owona Okono alluded to. We need to be interrogating how African demographics and European demographics can help each other. The final thing, Africa at the moment has a median age just over 20. Europe sits at 44. You don't need to be a labor expert to understand how you can be able to balance those scales in a way that benefits both Africa and Europe and limits the risks that come with policies that don't respond to the real issues.
Thank you very much. I think you already kind of responded to the second question that I had for you, but I think I'll try to pose it differently. You really highlighted the issue is the question that we're discussing is not necessarily to look at it from a problem perspective, but from a solutions perspective. And I was wondering then, given this difference in, I would say, coining the challenge or the issue that we're talking about, do you think that then, of course, the summit starting tomorrow is not the panacea, and we cannot expect 2 days to resolve all the issues. But do you think that this question is something that can be ever discussed at eye to eye, continent to continent? Because listening to you, it seems that a lot of this is fundamentally defined by national agendas. How can we bring a conversation across two partners that, as you say, depend on each other and to some extent fear each other, to flip that conversation so that our people are not monetized? Because there are some conversation about replacing people or placing people back, and talking about opportunities that arise from mobility. You were talking about skills, about the movement of professionals, and give this more prominence. Do you think that this construct is the right construct to discuss this?
Thank you very much for that question. Now, like you say, obviously a dialogue between two continents may not always thrash out some of these issues, but you simply need to look at things that are happening on the ground at technical level by companies, recruiting, but also by innovations in money transfer that have been stimulated by the existence of a diaspora. I often cite the example of Somalia. Somalia has a high, has a big diasporic community, largely because of years of conflict within Somalia, but also because of a history of being a nomadic and migratory population. Now, Somalia also hasn't had the chance, perhaps, that other countries have had that have been more stable to develop at pace. But where did mobile technology for money transfers evolve and come from? It came from Somalia. Necessity being the mother of invention, learning from the things that you do not have and the things that you need. I use that as an example, anecdotal as it may be, because it helps us reframe the way we look at different things. What has Africa benefited from having large diasporic communities, whether within the continent or out of? Look at the fact that remittances outnumber foreign direct investment and overseas development assistance combined. So not just the one or the other. Remittances alone are helping build some communities on this continent. Look at Zimbabwe, Ghana, Somalia itself, Kenya, countries that are benefiting from remittances. Egypt as well has seen an overtaking of that. How do you leverage that and build an ecosystem that allows for it? It's everything from reducing the cost of remittances. It's big financial institutions finding that actually we can stand to benefit if this money goes through us and not from outside of us. It's recognizing that the reason these remittances are so high is because people are leaving, getting jobs that are able to ensure that they can be able to send money back home. But practically, let's use Germany as a country of example here. Practically, it also means that those same people are paying taxes there. It's better if they are there legally, because then without a doubt, their incomes do go directly into the fiscus. So again, turning things on their head. Do you want 20 million people that are undocumented or unregistered that may not be able to contribute directly to socioeconomic development? Or would you rather the same 20 million people making a positive impact because they are not perceived as criminal, but actually economic contributors? So it's not about monetizing people. Bluntly, it's about monetizing what is already monetized, which is money itself, and ensuring that those flows are better regulated. And I'll restate this, Isabelle. Whether we like it or not, people are going to move. The question we need to be asking ourselves is, should people be moving through illegal channels, risking their lives, or through better, legal, safe, orderly, regulated migration? Almost goes without saying, but I would much prefer the latter.
Thank you very much. This is a really good way of ending this part of the conversation. I'm just relaying a comment that I'm seeing in the chat box. Lamouche Anjou says communities need to be engaged in the discussion about migration issues instead of just policymakers and researchers making those decisions. Let me now move to share about trade, which is one of my favorite subjects. So the coming into force of the African Continental Free Trade Area in January last year marked a key milestone for the African continent. It is aimed at boosting intra-Africa trade and at creating a coherent and single market of 55 countries, with ultimate goal of providing economic and business opportunities to transform our economies. And to come back to what the two previous speakers were saying, this is absolutely critical to address climate diplomacy and also to provide jobs for people. As rightly mentioned by Dr. Herzberger-Fofana in her introductory remarks, Europe as a bloc is Africa's main trading partner. But yet, when you look at the basket of trade, we notice that African countries' exports have not evolved since colonial times. We remain raw material exporters, while European exports towards Africa have become more sophisticated. And historical trade relations between the two continents have not been very progressive. Unilateral trade preferences have not supported diversification, and trade liberalization deals through the, I would say, quote unquote, infamous EPAs have created havoc on the continent for regional integration, and in now threatening the implementation of the CFTA. So, Cheikh, if we are to reignite the trade relations that work for both continents while keeping the priorities for continental integration, what do you see the future trade relations look like?
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Isabelle, pour la question. Et je voudrais exprimer mon plaisir à participer à cette conversation. Vous avez bien fait de relever que la relation commerciale entre l'Europe et l'Afrique est restée quasi structurellement la même depuis plusieurs décennies, depuis presque l'indépendance de la plupart des pays africains, en ce qui concerne notamment sa nature. On peut voir que depuis les conventions de Lomé jusqu'aux conventions, depuis d'ailleurs les conventions de Yaoundé au démarrage jusqu'à Lomé, ces relations ont consolidé la place de l'Afrique dans une sorte de spécialisation qui a mis les pays africains dans un rôle de fournisseurs de matières premières et d'importateurs de produits manufacturés, c'est-à-dire comme des débouchés des industries européennes. Et cette situation aujourd'hui montre effectivement que quand vous regardez la composition des exportations de l'Afrique vers l'Europe, c'est quasiment la même depuis le début. Ce sont des produits qui ne sont pas du tout ou très faiblement transformés pour l'essentiel, ce qui, bien entendu, explique en partie la marginalisation de l'Afrique dans les chaînes de valeur globales. On y reviendra un peu plus tard, notamment même les chaînes de valeur où l'Afrique a un avantage comparatif important, notamment les chaînes de valeur agroalimentaires et autres. Bon, il y a quand même cependant une évolution dans cette structuration de la relation commerciale, puisqu'effectivement, on est resté les mêmes sur l'exportation de matières premières et l'importation de produits manufacturés. Mais lorsque vous regardez en ce qui concerne la part de l'Europe dans le commerce africain, c'est là qu'il y a quand même une évolution notable qu'il convient de souligner, parce que cette évolution, c'est ça qui permet de comprendre les nouveaux enjeux économiques et géostratégiques qui reconfigurent les relations commerciales entre l'Europe et l'Afrique. Si vous regardez en effet que au début, vous l'avez dit d'ailleurs, la part de l'Europe dans les exportations ou dans le commerce avec l'Afrique représente à peu près 32% aujourd'hui, ce qui fait de l'Europe le partenaire le plus important. Et en valeur, en 2018, par exemple, c'était monté jusqu'à 235 milliards d'euros d'échanges dans les deux sens, en importation comme en exportation. Mais pour regarder effectivement qu'il y a quand même une tendance de changement important dans ces relations, il faut regarder que l'Europe a une sorte de perspective décroissante de ses parts dans le commerce africain. Et l'exemple le plus illustratif que j'aimerais donner, c'est la CEDEAO, la Communauté économique des États de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. En 1975, par exemple, lorsqu'on signait les conventions de Lomé, le commerce entre les pays de la CEDEAO et l'Union européenne était à peu près à 75%. C'est-à-dire que 75% du commerce des pays de la CEDEAO se faisait avec l'Union européenne en 1975, donc à peu près une quarantaine d'années. Aujourd'hui, la part de l'Europe dans le commerce de la CEDEAO est descendue jusqu'à 27%. Donc cela vous montre que, au fil des décennies, ça n'a pas changé du point de vue de la nature, ou ça a changé très faiblement, mais du point de vue des parts de commerce des partenaires, il y a un effort de diversification des partenariats africains qui se sont retournés vers d'autres partenaires au moment où l'Europe a une part qui baisse de manière quasi structurelle. La Chine ou d'autres pays en Asie continuent d'augmenter, mais également dans le cadre du commerce intra-africain, qui aussi connaît une évolution, même si elle est marginale et assez faible, il y a quand même une évolution du commerce intra-régional, ce que d'ailleurs devrait consolider la zone de libre-échange continentale en gestation. Et c'est dans ce contexte-là, bien entendu, où l'Europe a cette relation qui est quasi figée du point de vue de la nature, mais qui baisse du point de vue de ses parts de commerce, que l'Europe a proposé des accords de libre-échange avec les pays africains, répartis en différents blocs de négociation. En théorie, ces accords auraient dû modifier la relation commerciale pour l'améliorer, mais également renforcer le processus d'intégration régionale. Malheureusement, après plus de 15 ans de négociations, ces accords n'ont pas produit les effets qui étaient attendus, puisqu'on n'a pas eu, pour la plupart, n'ont pas pu atteindre leurs objectifs parce que toutes les régions qui ont négocié n'ont pas signé des accords de partenariat. Deuxièmement, parmi les régions qui ont négocié, certaines font face à une sorte d'effet négatif induit par ces accords du fait justement de la fragmentation de ces régions en plusieurs régimes commerciaux différents. Là aussi, l'exemple le plus illustratif, mais c'est aussi le cas pour d'autres régions, c'est l'exemple de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, la CEDEAO et la Mauritanie, puisque dans ces négociations, les 15 de la CEDEAO étaient avec la Mauritanie pour négocier un accord de partenariat. Aujourd'hui, au moment où je vous parle, les pays de la CEDEAO sont fragmentés en 5 régimes commerciaux différents vis-à-vis de l'Union européenne, puisque un API régional aurait donné un seul régime, mais puisqu'il n'y a pas un API régional, la Côte d'Ivoire et le Ghana commercent avec l'Europe chacun avec son API intérimaire ou individuel si vous voulez. Les pays les moins avancés commercent avec l'Europe avec le dispositif tout sauf les armes qui est spécifique. Le Nigeria qui n'a pas signé un accord régional mais qui n'a pas non plus signé un accord intérimaire continue de commercer avec le système généralisé de préférence et le Cap-Vert a un système de généralisé de préférence renforcé. Donc la même région qui veut un processus d'intégration régionale, qui veut renforcer sa politique économique et commerciale vis-à-vis de son partenaire le plus important, commerce avec 5 régimes différents. Tout ceci doit donc changer puisque effectivement vous voyez que cela induit des défis. Et aujourd'hui, si on regarde de près les relations de manière générale, Europe et Afrique, le commerce apparaît comme le point le plus sensible, le point de tension le plus important. D'ailleurs, vous vous souvenez que même à Lisbonne, lorsqu'on négociait la stratégie conjointe Europe-Afrique et que les acteurs politiques, les chefs d'État européens et africains parlaient d'un partenariat d'égal à égal, de solidarité, de plus de coopération et autres, au même moment, les négociateurs, les techniciens européens et africains étaient dans les salles de négociation et quasiment s'empoignaient parce que l'Europe ne voulait pas du tout au plan technique donner à l'Afrique ce qu'elle demandait, c'est-à-dire une négociation qui soit porteuse de développement, qui n'impose pas un niveau de libéralisation qui soit au-delà de ce que les pays africains étaient capables de soutenir, puisque la majorité des pays africains sont des pays les moins avancés. Donc, à mon avis, et c'est là que je vais finir sur cette partie, il faudra quasiment changer de paradigme. Changer de paradigme, c'est d'abord dans un premier temps que l'Europe accepte. C'est difficile, politiquement assez compliqué, mais il faut que l'Europe accepte de réexaminer ou de renégocier les accords de partenariat économique. Je donne encore l'exemple de la CEDEAO, l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Soit on accepte de renégocier les APE pour aller à un accord qui soit acceptable, ou alors la région va continuer de refuser les APE, notamment le Nigeria, et donc il n'y aura pas d'APE et on va rester dans cette logique de fragmentation des régimes commerciaux. Alors il y a beaucoup d'arguments qui militent justement pour cette renégociation. Beaucoup d'Africains le demandent, de réexaminer les accords de partenariat économique. Et le premier argument qui milite pour la renégociation justement, c'est le Brexit. D'ici de l'Afrique, on peut voir l'Europe qui a changé. Et beaucoup d'acteurs de la société civile, du secteur privé, même des acteurs officiels, disent à l'Union européenne, au démarrage des négociations, l'Europe avait été configurée autour de 27 ou plus, c'était 28 je crois, mais maintenant avec la sortie de la Grande-Bretagne, qui est quand même un morceau très important de l'Union européenne, vous voyez que l'Europe elle-même change de nature. Du coup, les engagements qui étaient pris par l'Europe dans les APE, lorsqu'elle était en totalité, aujourd'hui quand même changent et ses partenaires peuvent lui demander aussi d'ajuster ses engagements. Le deuxième élément, argument important, c'est la renégociation de l'accord de Cotonou et les engagements post-Cotonou. Vous voyez que le partenariat aussi change, les instruments de la coopération européenne ont changé et aujourd'hui, même dans le dispositif de financement, il y a juste NDCI qui configure encore ce partenariat économique et financier et qui doit aussi obliger à regarder de près ce qui s'y passe. Troisième élément, c'est la crise Covid-19, avec les politiques de relance que les pays africains sont en train de mettre en place. Est-ce qu'en ce moment-là, il est possible pour certains pays d'aller vers des politiques de libéralisation, de respecter leurs engagements vis-à-vis de l'Europe au moment où ils ont besoin de marge de manœuvre au plan politique? Donc, je pense qu'en plus de la renégociation, un deuxième élément, c'est que l'Europe, pendant qu'on est dans cette discussion du sommet Afrique-Europe, devrait avoir une nouvelle perspective pour quitter son option utilitariste et court-termiste. L'Europe est en train de pousser tout de suite vers les accords de libre-échange en réaction presque vis-à-vis des pays émergents de la Chine et autres qu'elle considère comme étant sa concurrente en Afrique. Et au contraire, il me semble que l'Europe doit, tenir compte de son passé avec l'Afrique, du partenariat traditionnel avec l'Afrique et du fait que l'Europe et l'Afrique se connaissent sans doute mieux qu'entre l'Afrique et les autres, l'Europe devrait promouvoir un partenariat productif qui soit un partenariat durable et fondé sur la coproduction et qui permet justement de faire émerger des chaînes de valeur euro-africaines. Et cela passe, à mon avis, par le remplacement des préférences commerciales traditionnelles par des préférences productives. On doit soutenir les pays africains là où ils ont de réels avantages pour transformer les matières premières et les produits sur place. Je n'ai jamais compris pourquoi on peut être ou accepter que le cacao de la Côte d'Ivoire et du Ghana ne peuvent être transformés et faire du bon chocolat, qu'à Bruxelles, à Amsterdam, à Paris ou ailleurs, alors qu'il est possible de les transformer localement avec un minimum d'accompagnement, d'investissement, de technologie et de formation. Troisième et dernier élément ici, c'est sur la zone de libre-échange, comme vous l'avez dit, Isabelle, c'est un processus extrêmement important pour l'Afrique qui vise justement à réduire les défis africains en matière de capacité productive, à harmoniser et structurer un marché africain. Et cette zone de libre-échange doit être accélérée, doit être soutenue et appuyée, et éviter justement que les accords de partenariat avec l'Europe qui ont déjà été signés par certains pays ou régions ne soient une contrainte qui empêche justement la réalisation du potentiel de la ZLECAf. Donc voilà un peu pour apporter une réponse à votre questionnement, les éléments que je voulais juste mettre sur la table. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, cher. Et je pense que je vais entrer directement aussi dans les questions-réponses parce qu'il y a beaucoup de questions qui arrivent de la part de nos participants et la plupart des questions, en fait, sont sur ce que vous parlez, les questions commerciales. Et peut-être pour faire un suivi de ce que vous disiez sur la ZLECAf et sur les chaînes de valeur, je pense que vous disiez qu'il fallait renégocier, que c'était difficile de trouver la volonté politique de le faire. Mais la ZLECAf en elle-même, le fait que maintenant c'est 55 pays, ce n'est plus l'Afrique subsaharienne parce que les APE, ça ne couvre pas l'Afrique du Nord. Et donc du coup, maintenant, le fait d'avoir un cadre qui est déjà mise en œuvre, et la négociation continue pour l'approfondir sur les services, etc., pour les prochaines phases. Est-ce que ça, ce ne serait pas en lui-même une base? Parce que quand on pense aux APE, quand on pense à la structure des APE, à ce qui était dans les APE, je pense que ce modèle de commerce est lui-même assez dépassé. Quand on regarde aujourd'hui les GAFA, les top 5 entreprises mondiales, elles ne font pas de commerce de biens et de services, elles font de commerce des idées, c'est la connaissance, les idées et les services. Donc, je me demande, est-ce que tout ça ensemble ne serait pas une occasion de rediscuter du modèle même, d'oublier les termes du passé. Ça, c'est la première chose. La deuxième chose, il y a pas mal de questions qui viennent dans les Q&A sur les chaînes de valeur et le fait que, par exemple, avec la question de changement climatique, le fait que l'Afrique soit très riche, et tout à l'heure, Saliem l'a mentionné, en ressources minières critiques, est-ce que vous ne pensez pas que l'industrialisation et la valeur ajoutée ne devrait pas aussi faire partie de cette discussion pour une nouvelle relation commerciale entre l'Europe et l'Afrique. Donc, au-delà du commerce des biens et services purs, mais pour prendre en considération le potentiel industriel du continent africain.
Sans doute, Isabelle, vous avez parfaitement raison. Et sur le premier élément, justement, la zone de libre-échange continentale a cette vocation. En tout cas, c'est son ambition. Il est évident qu'elle ne sera pas une panacée qui réglera tous les problèmes de l'Afrique, bien sûr, mais c'est un bon point de départ. Et parce que pour une fois, il y a une perspective à long terme qui est adossée à la vision 2063 de l'Afrique et qui permet justement, avec cette ambition, de consolider, de construire un marché africain. Et ça donne une réponse à une série de questions que l'Afrique s'est toujours posées, c'est-à-dire quels sont les axes de sa prochaine politique commerciale lorsqu'elle sera devenue une entité juridique, etc. La ZLECAf donne corps à la vision qui était même développée dans le rapport 2015 de la Commission économique pour l'Afrique, l'industrialisation par le commerce. C'était le titre de ce rapport. Et la ZLECAf essaye justement de matérialiser cette vision, c'est de passer à l'industrialisation de l'Afrique en développant sa politique commerciale et le marché à travers un accord continental. L'hypothèse est de dire, si nous libéralisons le marché africain pour les Africains, si nous enlevons les obstacles au commerce et qu'il y ait plus de demandes, plus de capacités et de possibilités commerciales, cela pourrait tirer l'investissement parce que la demande en ce moment-là pourrait avoir un effet sur l'investissement et du coup avoir un effet positif sur l'industrialisation. Et cette dimension de l'industrialisation me permet de toucher à la deuxième partie de la question importante que vous évoquez. On ne peut pas parler de développement en Afrique aujourd'hui, demain ou après-demain, sans mettre le curseur ou la centralité sur l'industrialisation et la transformation structurelle. C'est là où l'Afrique a eu un retard historique qu'il faut combler. Combler ne veut pas dire suivre la trajectoire des autres pays. Combler veut aussi dire ou veut dire, dans le contexte actuel où les progrès technologiques permettent de faire des raccourcis et de changer des modèles, de pouvoir aller vers cette industrialisation en empruntant quelquefois des chemins différents. Mais quoi qu'il en soit, on sait que l'un des défis les plus importants de l'Afrique en matière d'industrialisation, justement, c'est cette question technologique et ensuite la question des investissements. Alors, ces questions-là restent importantes. J'espère que pour une fois, au niveau du sommet Europe-Afrique, ce sera au cœur des débats et que les volontés politiques, ou en tout cas les décisions ou les engagements qui seront pris au plan politique seront matérialisés dans un futur proche. Il y a une conséquence pour l'Afrique, ou en tout cas un prérequis, ça c'est la responsabilité des Africains, de pouvoir bâtir, avant de demander de l'appui au plan technologique ou des investissements, de régler la question des politiques au niveau du continent. La politique agricole continentale africaine, la politique industrielle, la politique commerciale qui est aujourd'hui en gestation, tout ça doit être très cohérent, très clairement identifié pour que tout ce qui rentre sur le continent soit en mesure d'être challenné ou d'être dirigé vers là où il y a vraiment un avantage. L'autre élément, c'est sur les chaînes de valeur. Il y a aujourd'hui une opportunité importante pour l'Afrique de s'insérer dans des chaînes de valeur globales. Mais mon avis est que pour pouvoir s'insérer dans des chaînes de valeur globales, l'Afrique devrait commencer par bâtir ses propres chaînes de valeur régionales. Parce qu'il est difficile quelquefois de s'insérer dans des chaînes qui sont déjà établies et contrôlées quasiment de bout en bout par des grandes multinationales, pour la plupart qui sont au nord. Mais si on part de chaînes de valeur régionales qui peuvent à un moment donné se greffer à ces chaînes globales, cela peut nous faciliter un peu le chemin. Et lorsque je parle des chaînes de valeur régionales, l'avantage le plus important de l'Afrique, bien entendu, c'est avant tout dans les questions agroalimentaires. Et là, lorsqu'on utilise aujourd'hui l'évolution de la classe moyenne africaine, les capacités de consommation, en dépit de la pauvreté qui est encore importante, on peut voir que la plupart des pays africains, les centres urbains se développent. Il y a l'émergence d'une classe moyenne qui a une certaine capacité de consommation, et cela aujourd'hui peut tirer une industrie agroalimentaire africaine centrée sur les matières premières africaines et qui répond à des besoins culturels de consommation qui sont différents des besoins de type occidentaux, mais qui soient centrés sur ce qui existe sur le continent. Cela peut être aussi un levier pour pouvoir accompagner ces choses. Donc, deux choses qui me paraissent être importantes, et c'est là que je termine, pour justement booster ce renforcement de l'industrialisation et de la transformation structurelle, travailler et investir de manière importante, pour ne pas dire massive, dans la résorption de ce gap technologique et technique. Aujourd'hui, il n'est pas possible de dire la connaissance doit être au nord seulement. On a vu même quand la COVID est arrivée et que c'est devenu une pandémie mondiale et un défi pour tout le monde, il a fallu que les Africains attendent des vaccins, il a fallu qu'on attende des médicaments ou on attende d'autres choses, alors qu'un travail un investissement et un transfert de technologie, un travail de formation interne en Afrique sur ces technologies et sur cette science aurait pu permettre à l'Afrique de bâtir des industries capables de porter cela. L'autre, c'est l'investissement. Et quand je dis investissement, je ne parle pas seulement des investissements dans de grands secteurs très complexes et sophistiqués. Bien sûr, il faut avoir l'ambition pour l'Afrique de dominer aussi la technologie et de pouvoir investir dans ces domaines. Mais dans un premier temps, je pense que là où il y a vraiment une urgence, c'est d'accompagner la création d'une véritable économie industrielle dans les territoires. Il ne faut pas qu'on investisse en Afrique et dans les pays que dans les capitales. Il faut accompagner les mouvements vers les territoires et dans chaque territoire local, il est possible d'avoir une économie industrielle qui règle les problèmes alimentaires, qui règle les problèmes d'emploi décents et qui structure des écosystèmes simples avec des petites et moyennes entreprises, avec des startups pour donner de l'emploi et du travail aux jeunes. Donc cela, pour finir, me paraît être un élément important qui doit sortir de ce sommet pour que l'Europe et l'Afrique reprennent le paradigme de leur partenariat et qu'on investisse dans la sécurité humaine. Aujourd'hui, le contexte post-Covid impose que toutes les politiques commerciales, tous les accords commerciaux aient pour vocation et pour ambition de renforcer cette sécurité humaine qui passe par des emplois décents, par la protection sociale, par l'éducation de qualité, par l'accès aux santé, aux structures de santé et l'accès à des médicaments, à des vaccins. Et tout ça ne doit pas être produit seulement au Nord ou en Europe notamment. Mais avec l'Europe, l'Afrique devrait installer ses capacités productives sur le continent pour pouvoir avoir aussi son autonomie et jouer un rôle dans le futur.
Merci beaucoup, Cher. I would like now to send a question to Saliem that is coming from the chat. So Saliem, Lamusha is asking you, what will be the role of the transformation of global financial markets and economic system to be more just and inclusive in climate diplomacy?
This is a question that we are obviously very interested in, because models of climate finance at the present moment are largely located in structures that are not necessarily fit for purpose. So at one level, it is about finance for the creation of public goods. And certainly if you were to examine the amount of funding that goes towards green economy activities, particularly from the Global Green Fund, you find that particularly in Africa and elsewhere, it's not in the form of grants, it's largely concessional loans, and it's there to create increased indebtedness. In fact, in some cases, subsidizing private finance. They always talk about leveraging climate finance, private finance, and crowding in private finance. And private finance won't participate in anything, particularly on the African continent, if it wasn't able to extract. There's another form of extractiveness in which they can extract a large share of profits from a source of funding from public sector that protect their interests. So we have to actually revisit the architecture of finance globally. That's the one thing. We have to make larger shares of public finance available. And we've done a lot of work on the continent that shows that public finance is very crucial for unlocking energy transitions, which then interlinks with industrialization that Dr. Cheikh Tidiane talked about, and also the ability of us to be able to benefit from our critical minerals. So finance, as they say, people have moved from physical colonization. They are now in financial colonization, and we have to really change the architecture of that. Some good work is being done by Kevin Gallagher and people at UNCTAD, UNIDO and other places on exactly this question about a global Green Deal, and how fundamentally to make a global Green Deal work, we have to revisit the global financial architecture post-World War II, particularly the Bretton Woods system, etc. So if that model doesn't change, the trillions that are needed to manage energy transitions, to support a new kind of modernization in which Africans can lead on that. They don't need to be going in with a begging bowl. We can actually structure projects on the continent. But in order for us to do that, we need cheaper sources of finance, which is not always forthcoming. And we have to change that. And one way to change that is for us to also think about pooling our own funds on the continent, particularly at a sub-regional level or regional level, to use the SDRs that could potentially be made available to the continent to create pool funds and guarantee mechanisms. We can also utilize increasingly our own sources of savings to do that, even though they are limited, to create these opportunities. We ourselves have to think out of the box. We cannot rely, particularly in the climate space, on aid assistance and forms of climate finance that is largely going to increase debt on the continent and increase market opportunities for companies outside of the continent. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Saliem. And this joins what Otilia was talking earlier about the capacity to mobilize diaspora funds, because I think there's a lot of money out there, not just domestic resource mobilization from the continent, but also resources lying with diaspora outside the continent. we have 6 minutes left for the end of our webinar. I'd like now to move to the way forward to talk a bit about the next steps and concrete areas. And I'd like to start with you, Otilia, because I think, you know, the issues that you mentioned earlier about looking at things from a positive perspective, I wanted to ask you, and this is for three panelists, if we want the partnership to work, we cannot, of course, do the same thing over and over again because we will never achieve a different result. What should we do differently? How do we think creatively so that, I know the summit is not a panacea, but the 3 years that we have to work together, not just from our heads of states or policymakers, but people were mentioning on the chat, the responsibilities also of us from think tanks, from communities, from non-state actors, that we can contribute to make the partnership function. I'd like to ask you, as by way of conclusion, to leave us with your 2 pieces of advice to our leaders, to our thought leaders like you are. What do you think you know, is needed to recast and elevate this partnership? And I'll start with you, Ottilia.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. The answer to your question for me is included in some of the comments and questions that have been posed by the audience. Lomusha in particular has spoken about consultations with Africans ahead of, but even post-summit. So the summit itself should not be seen as the end of the partnership. In fact, it is the 6th summit, 22 years into this iteration of the partnership. But in between, the level of consultation is not always as one would hope. And I think the recommendation there is if you want to have the right solutions, consult. Understand what the needs are in Côte d'Ivoire versus South Africa, Germany versus Spain, and be able to match those. And the people that will know that often aren't the policymakers always, but the people that should help inform that policy. The second comes from Cassius Lawson, who asked a question about the differences in regions on the African continent. The answer in that is the efforts to ensure, which is at AU level, the subsidiarity of regional mechanisms. SADC will bring to the table different needs when it comes to the partnership versus ECOWAS or ECAS or the EAC. So it's important then within that consultative process, consult the people and also consult the sub-regions. So my thanks goes to Lomusha and Cassius for giving me the answers.
Thank you. And there's Dauda who's saying a conversation of this nature needs to cover issues of value addition to Africa's natural resources to maximize its stake and advance its development, such as that will keep citizens away from illegal migration. So let me turn to you, Cheikh.
Merci, merci Isabelle. Je crois que la recommandation ou la suggestion qu'on peut faire à ce stade doit être dirigée, à mon avis, aux leaders, aux décideurs. Je crois que Otilia l'a dit tout à l'heure, il manque de la concertation, il manque du dialogue multi-acteurs et il manque de l'inclusion des acteurs dans les processus du partenariat. Le partenariat Europe-Afrique est un partenariat institutionnel bâti par le haut. Ça se fait de sommet en sommet et entre 2 sommets, on ne voit plus rien arriver et les acteurs ne savent même plus ce qui se passe. Jusqu'à la veille d'un sommet, on organise un forum de la jeunesse, on organise un forum du secteur privé, on organise un forum des scientifiques et c'est terminé, il y a des recommandations et on passe à autre chose. Je crois qu'il faut revenir à la base avec les acteurs en les mettant au centre de ce qui est en train d'être discuté aujourd'hui. Et une dernière chose, c'est que si nous voulons reprendre le partenariat ou le renouveler, il faut, à mon avis, 2 changements. Il y en a beaucoup, mais je mettrai en avant 2. Le premier changement, c'est un changement comportemental. En dépit de tout ce qu'on dit au plan politique et de la diplomatie, l'Europe, les experts européens, l'Union européenne, le staff et d'autres sont encore souvent dans une logique paternaliste lorsqu'il s'agit de l'Afrique. Logique paternaliste, logique qui consiste à penser que ce sont les projets européens, les propositions européennes et ces points de vue qui sont toujours les meilleurs ou les plus importants pour les Africains. Cet esprit doit changer. L'autre qui doit changer, c'est au niveau de l'Afrique, de l'Union africaine contre des autres Africains. Il faut sortir de la logique de l'assistance et de la logique de l'aide. Tant que les Africains ne prendront pas la responsabilité sur leur propre développement, en se disant que avoir des investissements étrangers, c'est bien, mais l'Afrique ne manque pas de ressources. L'Afrique doit travailler à mobiliser des ressources domestiques et à promouvoir son propre secteur privé pour transformer localement les matières premières et créer les chaînes de valeur régionales dont j'ai parlé. C'est une double prise de responsabilité qu'on doit avoir du côté de l'Europe comme du côté de l'Afrique pour libérer les opportunités qui se trouvent sur le continent, afin qu'il ne soit plus un continent qui est à la traîne, qui est un continent suiveur, qui fait court derrière l'Europe pour capter quelque chose et qui demain va courir aussi derrière la Chine, derrière l'Inde, derrière le Brésil. Il faut que l'Afrique se réautonomise, reconquiert sa souveraineté et réinvestisse sur le continent pour les Africains et par les Africains. Merci.
Merci, Cheikh. Salim, last word goes to you. Salim, are you muted?
Oh, sorry, I didn't. I wasn't sure whether I needed. I won't be long. I just think that certainly from the African Climate Foundation, we are working very hard to build a more whole economy approach to climate diplomacy, and we want to work very closely with think tanks in Africa, and particularly the regional bodies, and also the diplomatic arms of key pivot countries that are very involved in this discussion. I think it's very important to change the paradigm of how climate diplomacy works. Europe has effectively shifted that through the European Green Deal. And we have a little bit of catch up to do in terms of our own diplomacy. We can't just focus it just on the climate negotiations that are happening at every conference of parties, but we have to take a wider view around trade, around economic transformation. A whole set of other issues have to come into play, including the architecture of finance, as you mentioned. And a paradigm shift leads to a different way of making long-term judgments and also the actions that we invest in. So I think that's really key. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salim. And now I'd like to give 2 words to Mr. Owona and then to Dr. Herzberger before closing the conference. Mr. Owona.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Once again, thank you to all panelists. I'll just want to say a very quick word. We had some questions from the Q&A regarding the insecurity and so on. I think these are issues that we should, as Africans, address quickly, when it comes to governance and so on. What creates insecurity? What creates a hunger? These are issues that we should address. And then when we've solved these questions, then turn to Europe. Now we are trying to take action in order to work together with Europe, between Europe and Africa. So what do? We have our homework to do as Africans, and we expect the European counterpart to do its own. There was a question regarding the lands, access to lands. I think that also is a domestic issue. We should address it, and the situation is not the same all over Africa. But overall, if we want to develop Africa, we need to address the land issue, courageously, and we do not expect Europe to solve these questions for us. Now, once again, thank you to all the panelists, all the contributors from outside, from the panel. Hope to see you very, very soon, and courage for the 2 coming days.
Many thanks, Mr. Owona. So now I just wanted to say, if President Sall and President Macron are listening to us today, here are good ideas for you. Let me thank the panel for this very interesting conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It was really inspiring, and I hope that in the next 3 years, APRI will continue to host such very interesting conversations. We have many things to discuss, many things to unpack. We couldn't go through all the list of questions because time not being on our side, but I'm sure we can convene many more conversations like this, because this is where ideas come from. And I would like to thank Olu and his team from APRI for having put this program together and for bringing such brilliant brains around the table today to talk about Africa's aspiration for a renewed partnership with Europe, one that we hope will transcend grand statements and glossy family pictures to bring home strategic outcomes and opportunities for our people. So thank you very much for staying with us and for being engaged during the conversation. Goodbye for now, and see you soon on another webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alors,
Thank you.
Bye.
je voulais dire merci aussi à tout le monde, hein, à
Thank
tous les
you.
panélistes et aussi à tous ceux qui sont restés jusqu'à la fin avec nous. C'était très inspirant et je dois vous dire que personnellement, j'ai retenu certains points. C'est par exemple le manque de concertation qui est un problème, et je pense qu'au niveau de notre commission développement, je mettrai l'accent là-dessus. Et aussi, ce que le docteur Dieye a dit, c'est de revoir les rapports de commerce en mettant l'accent sur la création, en faisant confiance à l'expertise locale, à l'expertise africaine, qui est capable donc elle-même de se développer par elle-même aussi, puisqu'elle connaît ses propres besoins. Je crois que l'Union européenne a quand même essayé de faire un pas vers ce sens-là, puisqu'il y a eu des accords entre l'Union européenne et certains instituts d'Afrique en ce qui concerne la question des vaccins, et on espère que c'est un tout petit pas, il est vrai, mais c'est un pas qui va commencer. J'ai trouvé aussi très intéressant tout ce que vous avez dit sur la question du chocolat, et aussi que est-ce que le Green Deal, c'est une grande question, surtout pour nous les Verts, est-ce que le Green Deal n'est pas en fait une barrière en Afrique? Donc c'est de revoir aussi tous ces termes-là, tout ce que l'on pense qui est bien, qui pourrait aider au développement, et se rendre compte que non, il y a aussi d'autres opportunités. J'espère qu'on aura l'occasion encore de continuer à travailler avec APRI, et merci beaucoup, c'était très très inspirant, très constructif, et je vous souhaite à tous une bonne après-midi, et merci à tous ceux qui sont restés jusqu'à la fin, et nous avons lu aussi toutes les questions que nous ferons suivre, et vous aurez aussi des réponses. Merci bien et à bientôt.
Merci à tous.
Merci, au revoir et bon voyage, madame.
Merci, madame.
Merci, allez, au revoir.
Merci bien, au revoir.
Merci, au
On
revoir.
a pu faire la photo de famille finalement, je ne sais pas si on l'a fait, oui. Oui, bon, il y a au moins les assistants qui ont peut-être fait une photo, on verra. Voilà, au revoir et merci bien.
Merci.
Merci.